In the spring of 101 CE, Emperor Trajan mobilized the Roman war machine. Tens of thousands of legionaries pushed north across the Danube River, launching a massive, calculated assault into the heavy forests of Dacia. After a year of relentless military pressure, the Dacian king Decebalus surrendered. By 102 CE, he was forced to accept a severe peace treaty, temporarily neutralizing the threat to Rome's Danubian frontier. That same year, a parallel victory occurred over 4,000 miles to the east. General Ban Chao returned to the Han capital of Luoyang after a decades-long military campaign that successfully secured the Tarim Basin and the trade routes of Central Asia. The year 102 CE marks a rare moment of simultaneous stability for the ancient world's two largest powers. Rome had locked down its European border, while the Han Dynasty had neutralized its Western adversaries. 3 years later, the focus of the Han Empire shifted from military hardware to imperial administration. In 1005 CE, a court official named Cai Lun introduced a new medium for recording information. Instead of carving into heavy bamboo slips or writing on expensive silk, Cai Lun supervised the pressing of mulberry bark, discarded rags, and old fish nets into a wet, fibrous pulp. Once dried on a mesh screen, this mixture formed a thin, flexible sheet. This early paper was cheap to produce in large quantities. It allowed the Han government to generate, distribute, and store vast archives of administrative records and standardize official communications across the provinces. By lowering the cost of information storage, paper solidified the Han Dynasty's intellectual and bureaucratic infrastructure. The state now possessed a highly efficient administrative network, exactly when it would need to manage a sudden accumulation of external threats. In Europe, the brief period of peace shattered. In 105 CE, Decebalus violated the terms of his treaty, provoking Trajan to march the legions back across the Danube for a final, decisive campaign. By 106 CE, Roman forces had besieged and razed the Dacian capital of Sarmizegetusa. Decebalus took his own life, and the kingdom was completely dismantled. The total annexation of Dacia gave Rome direct control over the region's immense gold and silver mines. This injection of capital immediately funded an ambitious wave of public works, including the expansive complex of Trajan's Forum in the heart of Rome. The Roman state carefully curated the memory of this violence. The logistics, battles, and spoils of the Dacian campaigns were carved into the continuous spiral relief of Trajan's column, serving as permanent public propaganda. While the legions secured Dacia, Trajan simultaneously ordered the annexation of the Nabataean kingdom to the southeast. The sophisticated, rock-cut city of Petra and its surrounding territories were absorbed, granting Rome direct control over lucrative Red Sea trade routes. In the span of 2 years, Rome's foreign policy shifted from border defense to total acquisition. By absorbing Dacia and Nabataea, the empire converted aggressive military campaigns into permanent, wealth-generating economic arteries. By 107 CE, the global geopolitical landscape was shifting. While the Parthian Empire executed religious dissidents and a Japanese envoy presented tribute in Luoyang, the Han imperial court was quietly facing a severe financial crisis. Maintaining garrisons thousands of miles from the capital had drained the treasury. To cut costs, Empress Dowager Deng issued an order to systematically evacuate Han military forces from the western regions. Han forces pulled out of the Tarim Basin, retracting defensive lines eastward. To cover this retreat, the government conscripted local Qiang cavalry. But in 1008 CE, these conscripts mutinied, erupting into violent rebellion within Liang province. The two empires approached the decade's pressures with opposing strategies. Rome chose to attack and absorb neighboring wealth to sustain its economy, while the Han Dynasty attempted a strategic retreat to save money, compromising its internal security. Sensing the weakness created by the Han retreat, northern nomadic coalitions seized the initiative. By 109 CE, the Xiongnu and their allies launched a massive, coordinated offensive against the exposed borders. The Han military structure could not contain the dual pressures of the Chang mutiny and the nomadic incursions. In 110 CE, the imperial government made the drastic decision to completely evacuate the civilian population from Liang province, abandoning the land to the rebels. Physical infrastructure was left behind. Watchtowers and garrisons that once protected the Silk Road were emptied, left to weather the harsh desert winds. The collapse of the physical frontier triggered a psychological reaction among the population. Facing displacement, war, and disease, widespread rumors began to circulate about a mystical, hidden mountain paradise in Tibet where refugees could escape the suffering. As 110 CE came to a close, the trajectories of the two empires had firmly diverged. Rome had leveraged sheer military force to become a heavily fortified engine of wealth, while the technologically advanced Han Dynasty was slowly fragmenting under the crushing weight of an indefensible frontier. In 111 CE, the northwestern edge of the Han Dynasty is tearing itself apart. The Chang rebellion is ravaging Liang province, resulting in devastating bloodshed. This map shows the primary Silk Road trade routes connecting east and west. Because of the escalating conflict, the critical bottleneck at Liang province is completely severed, entirely blocking China's access to Western trade networks. Suppressing this relentless uprising is an immense financial drain. The Han military response burns through tens of millions of cash coins, wiping out a massive percentage of annual minting and draining the imperial treasury. By 113 CE, the timeline shifts sharply to the west, where Rome applies a different strategy to its own frontiers. Emperor Trajan initiates a massive, unprovoked military campaign against the Parthian Empire. His objective is to permanently secure Roman dominance in the east. By 114 CE, Trajan pushes his legions across the border, executing a violent and successful invasion of Armenia. He quickly deposes and executes the region's Parthian-backed ruler, Parthomasiris. The independent Armenian kingdom is liquidated and absorbed directly into the Roman provincial system. By this year, the world's two superpowers are pursuing opposite imperial methods. Rome is driving outward through military aggression, while the Han state prioritizes an internal defense to prevent its borders from collapsing further. In 115 CE, Trajan overruns northern Mesopotamia, pushing the Roman Empire to its maximum territorial size. Roman legions capture the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, marching entirely unimpeded downriver to the Persian Gulf. That exact same year, the Han government enforces severe austerity measures across its entire empire. The state repairs a few vital water control works, but leaves standard public infrastructure projects underfunded. The imperial budget has run dry, strained by the mounting costs of widespread natural disaster relief and the grueling, ongoing war against the Qiang. By 116 CE, the Han court turns inward. Emperor An issues a traditionalist edict, requiring government officials to step down and mourn a deceased parent for 3 full years. While Rome spent its resources to conquer the world, the Han Dynasty was cannibalizing its own infrastructure to survive it. Between 115 and 117 CE, Trajan's rapid eastern conquests backfire. Revolts erupt across the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, breaking out directly behind advancing Roman lines. The outbreak of the Kidos War, a major Jewish rebellion, ignites across the Roman East, stretching military resources to their limit. These internal rebellions force the legions to halt their eastward advance, ultimately preventing the total defeat of Parthia. In August of 117 CE, Emperor Trajan suddenly falls ill and dies. The period of Roman expansion ends with him. His successor, Hadrian, takes power and immediately moves to liquidate Trajan's eastern ambitions.
Executing a total strategic pivot, Hadrian abandons the newly won Mesopotamian territories entirely, ordering Roman forces to fall back to defensible borders. Unchecked military expansion overloaded the state's capacity to govern, forcing Rome to choose between holding its outer conquests and surviving as a functional state. By 118 CE, the Han Dynasty finally succeeds in suppressing the Chang rebellion in Liang province. This definitive military victory officially lifts the decade-long blockade that had closed off China's western borders. The consequences of this stabilization arrive by 120 CE, marked by a sudden influx of foreign contact at the Han imperial court. The king of Chan, located in modern-day Burma, sends a diplomatic gift to the Han emperor, a traveling troupe of illusionists, acrobats, and fire-spitters. These performers claim to originate from west of the seas, specifically from Roman Egypt. After a decade defined by isolating warfare on both sides of the Eurasian landmass, the first major documented interaction between the Roman and Chinese spheres arrives as traveling entertainers. Rome's strategic retraction and the stabilized Han frontier allowed the previous status quo to return. The vital arteries of trade reopened, allowing these two empires to inch closer together in the decades to follow.
On April 17th, Empress Dowager Deng Sui died. She had managed state affairs as regent for over a decade, providing a period of stability even during financial crises. Her death ended that continuity, leaving the Han court in a sudden power vacuum. Emperor An acted within weeks to seize total control. He authorized imperial guards to move through the palace, arresting the late empress's family members and stripping the Deng clan of their authority. The emperor utilized charges of treason to dismantle his political rivals. By June 3rd, he had forced many in the Deng family into suicide and exiled the survivors to the empire's most remote regions. This internal consolidation signaled a change in the dynasty's priorities. With his domestic enemies removed, Emperor An focused the Han military on policing the empire's existing territory rather than seeking new conquests in the west. In 122 CE, the Roman Empire was facing its own logistical limits in northern Britannia. The legions had taken the southern half of the island, but the rugged terrain to the north made further advancement difficult and costly. Emperor Hadrian arrived on the frontier and chose to abandon the policy of continuous conquest. He decided that the empire had reached its sustainable capacity and that Roman territory now required protection rather than expansion. To define this limit, he ordered a 73-mile stone wall to be built across northern England. Standing higher than 12 feet in many sections, the barrier was designed to regulate trade and serve as a permanent military zone against northern tribes. In 123 CE, Hadrian extended this defensive strategy to the east. He negotiated a peace with the Parthians, establishing a diplomatic boundary that avoided the expense of a major war over the Mesopotamian frontier. Simultaneously, the Han general Ban Chao was using diplomatic influence to resecure the Tarim Basin. By 123, he had brought the region back under imperial control, effectively locking down the eastern end of the Silk Road. Within a single 2-year window, the world's two largest powers moved to stabilize their frontiers. They recognized that the era of expansion was over, and that long-term survival now depended on maintaining these fixed lines. By 125 CE, with physical borders increasingly secure, both the Han and Roman empires saw a rise in state-sponsored technological and scientific projects. In China, the polymath Zhang Heng completed the world's first water-powered armillier sphere. He used a series of gears and a water clock to mechanically rotate a metal-ringed model of the heavens, allowing observers to track celestial motion with precision. In 127 CE, Claudius Ptolemy was conducting parallel work in Roman Alexandria. He used large celestial globes and observational instruments to begin his catalog of over 1,000 stars, mapping the sky for the Roman world. Ptolemy recorded a specific astronomical observation that helped define his geocentric model of the universe. This record established the data points that would remain the authority for Western and Middle Eastern astronomy for over a millennium. These nearly simultaneous achievements in the East and West show that as the empires stopped claiming new land, they began the systematic measurement of the world they already controlled. Between these two powers lay the Kushan Empire, which controlled the central territory connecting the Han and the Romans. Their stability was vital for the movement of people and ideas across the Eurasian landmass. Around 127 CE, King Kanishka took control of the Kushan state. He used his wealth and sovereign authority to maintain the mountain passes and trade routes, ensuring that the middle of the Silk Road remained secure. Kanishka sponsored a major Buddhist council to systematize the religion's teachings.
He used the newly stabilized trade routes to export this philosophy into China and Central Asia, leaving behind statues that blended Roman artistic styles with Indian theology. The rise of the Kushans proved that in a world of fixed borders, power was found in the ability to facilitate and control the flow of ideas between civilizations. As the decade reached 129 CE, the empires moved beyond simply defending their borders and began actively re-engineering the physical landscape of their provinces. In the east, the Han government took steps to re-establish two commanderies in Liang province. This was a calculated move to repopulate and stabilize a region that had been a center of rebellion for over a decade. That same year, Emperor Hadrian arrived in the Levant. He traveled to the ruined city of Jerusalem, which had remained largely in rubble since the Roman wars of the previous century. Hadrian ordered the city to be entirely rebuilt as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina. He replaced the original structures with Romanized buildings and temples, physically erasing the city's previous identity to integrate it into the imperial system. By 130 CE, this physical restructuring of the provinces had finalized the empire's internal control. However, the process of erasing old identities to enforce new ones created the local tensions that would lead to mass rebellions in the decade to follow.
In 131 CE, the imperial capital of Luoyang smelled of fresh pine and black ink. The Han Dynasty was rebuilding its government. Emperor Shun had just issued a decree to reconstruct and heavily fund the dilapidated Imperial University, a complex that had fallen into disrepair over the preceding decades. This institution functioned as a rigorous pipeline, training young men from the gentry class to enter the civil service and actively govern the vast Chinese provinces. For the Han Empire, survival required thousands of administrators who all read the same texts, followed the same laws, and implemented the same policies across millions of square miles. A year later, in 132 CE, that scholarly environment produced a breakthrough. A court astronomer named Zhang Heng presented the emperor with a bronze vessel unlike anything seen before. This cross-section shows the world's first seismometer. Designed to detect distant earthquakes, its core relied on a highly sensitive central pendulum. If the ground trembled, the pendulum engaged one of 8 mechanical levers extending toward the shell. That lever would trigger a latch, releasing a bronze ball from the mouth of a dragon on the vessel's exterior. It dropped into the waiting mouth of a bronze toad below, instantly alerting the court to the exact cardinal direction of the distant disaster. 5,000 miles to the west, that exact same year, another scholar was applying intense mathematical precision to the physical world. Working in the library at Alexandria, Claudius Ptolemy was cataloging the cosmos. This map illustrates Ptolemy's geographical grid system. By recording data like an autumn equinox in 132 CE, he gathered the mathematics to construct a comprehensive geocentric model of the universe, mapping the Earth using strict lines of latitude and longitude. By 132, the world's major powers were effectively using high-level mathematics to monitor the physical stability of the Earth and the predictable paths of the stars. But this quiet era of intellectual measurement was abruptly shattered by the noise of an uprising. In Judea, the Jewish population had endured decades of heavy Roman military occupation, shifting administrative rules, and finally, the construction of a pagan temple to Jupiter directly in Jerusalem. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, the rebellion ignited in 132 CE. To the absolute shock of the Roman command, the local insurgents rapidly defeated the stationed legions in a string of tactical victories. For nearly 3 years, Bar Kokhba pushed the Romans out and administered a fully independent Jewish state.
It was a glaring rupture in the carefully manicured image of the Pax Romana. It proved to the imperial court that the eastern frontier was not held by mutual loyalty, but only by the continuous threat of force. By 135 CE, Emperor Hadrian responded. He directed a massive influx of Roman legions back into Judea, with clear instructions to eliminate the rebellion entirely. The Roman army systematically crushed the insurgents. Bar Kokhba's independent state was dismantled block by block. The resulting toll was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish residents died in the conflict, and the Romans glutted the international slave markets with the exiled survivors. To ensure the province would never rise again, Hadrian issued strict decrees barring Jewish people from Jerusalem. He then officially erased the name Judea from the map entirely, redesignating the territory as Syria Palestina. Rome maintained its borders by deploying its vast bureaucracy to systematically erase a culture's identity and homeland from the public record. That same year, the Han court in China was navigating a different kind of transition. While Rome fought a visible war, Luoyang was being reshaped by a single administrative policy. In 135 CE, Emperor Shun issued an official decree allowing the adopted sons of court eunuchs to legally inherit their father's political fiefs and titles. The highly educated civil servants, the very scholars trained at the repaired Imperial University, protested bitterly. They watched as political power bypassed the merit-based examination system and flowed directly to the inner court. By formalizing that wealth and status could be passed down through the eunuchs' chosen heirs, the emperor permanently fractured the administration. This entrenched the power of the palace eunuchs, ensuring that merit would no longer be the sole requirement for governing China.
3 years later, on July 10, 138 CE, Emperor Hadrian died at his sprawling villa in Baiae at the age of 62. Power transitioned immediately to his hand-picked adopted heir, a seasoned senator who took the name Antoninus Pius. His first order of business was to stand before a deeply reluctant Roman Senate and persuade them to officially deify Hadrian, cementing his adoptive father's legacy among the gods. Once secured, Antoninus managed the state in a way Rome had rarely seen. For his entire 23-year reign, he directed the governors and generals of a massive intercontinental empire exclusively through written correspondence, never once leaving Italy. While Hadrian spent years inspecting borders and suppressing revolts in person, Antoninus presided over a static, deeply entrenched administration. The empire had stopped expanding and settled into maintenance. By 140 CE, this pattern of consolidation reached the center of the continent, high in the mountains of Central Asia. The Kushan Empire, which bridged the gap between Han China and the Roman East, saw a new ruler, Huvishka, assume the throne.
He abandoned further expansion, opting instead to tighten his military grip over the cities of Mathura and the vital transit routes of the Silk Road. As the 130s ended, a new set of emperors held the major global thrones. Their focus had shifted from the conquest of new lands to the rigid consolidation of the trade networks and borders they already possessed. Emperor Antoninus Pius ordered his legions past the established borders of Roman Britain and deep into central Scotland. The goal was to construct a physical barrier to cut off the northern Caledonian tribes and lock down the extreme, unruly edge of the empire. Stretching coast to coast from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Clyde, this new Antonine wall was built with massive ramparts of layered turf on top of stone. Today, only these low stone foundations remain in the grass to mark its path. This earthen fortification represented the absolute physical limit of the ancient world's greatest power. Expanding the frontier this far stretched Roman logistics and manpower to their absolute breaking point. 2 years later, in the political center of Rome, a wealthy shipowner named Marcion triggered a completely different kind of border dispute within the church. Marcion proposed that there were actually two distinct gods. He argued that the creator God described in the Hebrew Bible was a wrathful, lesser deity, completely separate from the merciful, forgiving God revealed by Jesus. To support this theology, Marcion threw out the Old Testament entirely. He then edited the Gospel of Luke to remove references to Christ's physical flesh and blood incarnation. The Roman congregation officially returned his financial donations and excommunicated him in 144 CE. Unfazed, Marcion started his own rival church, which rapidly expanded throughout the empire. This theological rebellion presented an existential threat. To protect its ideological borders from internal collapse, the early church was forced to begin officially standardizing a Christian canon of scripture. While the church fractured, the Roman state celebrated a massive psychological milestone. The year 147 CE marked exactly 900 years since the mythic founding of Rome. Presiding over the festivities was Emperor Antoninus Pius. Unlike his predecessors, he never left Italy to command an army, choosing instead to govern an empire that was experiencing a prolonged era of internal peace and accumulating a massive fiscal surplus. To project Rome's earthly dominance over nature, the state hosted staggering public spectacles. Thousands of exotic animals were slaughtered here in the Colosseum, drawing crowds to marvel at the empire's physical and engineering might. Thousands of miles away from the roaring crowds of Rome, the mathematician Claudius Ptolemy was working in the quiet precision of Alexandria, erecting a public inscription at Canopus in 147 or 148 CE. The Roman state poured its immense wealth into celebrating its past physical conquests. Meanwhile, individual scholars like Ptolemy were quietly laying the mathematical groundwork to conquer the stars. Far to the east in Central Asia, the vast Kushan Empire was reaching its zenith under King Kanishka the Great, a ruler whose martial authority stretched across modern-day Pakistan, northern India, and Kashmir. Kanishka directed his vast resources towards standardizing religion, convening the Fourth Buddhist Council to reconcile increasingly fractured and conflicting sects. Hundreds of dedicated monks spent years engaged in high-stakes academic work, transcribing generations of oral traditions into formal Sanskrit and engraving their extensive commentaries onto copper sheets. This monumental organizational effort formally elevated Mahayana Buddhism. The teachings shifted, recasting the Buddha from a historical earthly teacher into a cosmic divine savior figure accessible to all. Kanishka's council took a regional Indian faith and standardized it into a transnational powerhouse, providing the codified texts and philosophy that would allow Buddhism to sweep across China and East Asia. Back in Alexandria around 150 CE, Claudius Ptolemy finalized the astronomical text that would define his legacy, a 13-book mathematical treatise known as the Almagest. This diagram illustrates Ptolemy's geocentric universe. He placed a stationary Earth at the center of the cosmos, with the sun, moon, and planets moving in complex looping epicycles along perfectly circular paths. Even though the model placed the Earth in the wrong position, Ptolemy applied strict mathematical rigor, including early trigonometric chord functions, so astronomers could use the system to make highly accurate celestial predictions. This map shows how he applied that same logic to the surface of the Earth. In his Geographia, Ptolemy revolutionized cartography by mapping the known inhabited world using a strict grid system of longitude and latitude. By defining the exact coordinates of the globe and the stars, Ptolemy established an intellectual monopoly over Western and Islamic science that would go unbroken for 1,400 years. As Ptolemy finalized his maps in 150 CE, Kanishka the Great's reign came to an end in the east. The Kushan Empire transitioned its authority to his successor, Huvishka, ensuring a smooth transfer of power and closing a definitive chapter in Central Asian history. Over the course of the decade, the Roman state had exhausted its legions to pile up turf and stone in the Scottish mud, desperately trying to define the physical edges of the world. Less than 2 decades later, that massive Antonine Wall would be completely abandoned to the elements. Yet the texts and ideas codified during these exact same eras survived. The physical borders forged by the era's greatest empires eventually turned to dust. But the metaphysical boundaries drawn between 141 and 150 CE, the mapped globe, the formalized Buddhist sutras, and the defined Christian canon, would dictate human thought for a millennium. By 151 CE, the Kushan Empire had reached its territorial limit. From the mountain passes of modern Afghanistan to the plains of northern India, the era of explosive conquest was ending. Huvishka, succeeding the conqueror Kanishka, focused his efforts on a new priority, exerting total administrative control over the dual capitals of Peshawar and Mathura. This was a period of calculated retrenchment. Huvishka's administration prioritized internal stabilization and the pacification of existing provinces over the risky pursuit of new land. The success of this consolidation is visible in the empire's standardized economy. On this gold coin minted under Huvishka, state-sanctioned blending of the imperial image with traditional deities served to anchor his authority across a multi-ethnic territory. In Mathura, the empire fortified its political center with symbols of physical permanence. This statue of the monarch, carved from red stone, stood as a constant reminder that imperial power was now an immovable fixture of the landscape. The pattern across the Kushan and Roman states reveals a shift in imperial strategy. Once an empire hits its logistical ceiling, maintaining internal control becomes more critical than acquiring more land. The Roman Empire was finalizing a nearly identical shift on the muddy, freezing frontier of central Scotland. The Roman legions had just completed the Antonine Wall. This turf and stone fortification was designed as the ultimate physical barrier to block the northern Caledonian tribes from moving south. This map shows Rome's northern frontier. Establishing the Antonine Wall past Hadrian's barrier marked the physical end of its British expansion. Maintaining this remote garrison created massive logistical strain, requiring grain and soldiers to move thousands of miles from the Mediterranean. The archaeological remains at the wall ground the desolate reality for the Roman garrisons. These rectangular foundations are the footprint of a state that had stretched its military power to the point of exhaustion. By 154, the Kushan and Roman empires had finalized their physical perimeters. With the borders fixed, the state began turning its attention toward ideological nonconformity within its own walls. In 155 CE, that internal scrutiny ignited in the provincial arena of Smyrna, in modern-day Turkey. Polycarp, the 84-year-old bishop of the city, was arrested and brought before a pagan mob that demanded he be held accountable for his beliefs. The charge was a refusal of civic duty. The proconsul ordered Polycarp to swear an oath to the genius of Caesar and offer sacrifice to the emperor. He refused. Roman law viewed such acts as more than a religious choice. Refusing to participate in state cults was considered a treasonous form of atheism that threatened the stability of the empire. For his refusal to conform to the state ideology, Polycarp was burned alive in the arena. It was a violent enforcement of the internal lines the empire was now drawing. Polycarp's death proves that Rome's most critical defenses were no longer built of stone. They were maintained through absolute civic and ideological conformity. As persecution in the provinces grew, an intellectual counteroffensive was drafted in the heart of Rome. Justin Martyr published his first apology, a philosophical plea addressed to Emperor Antoninus Pius. Justin argued that Christians were rational, obedient citizens. He attempted to prove that their loyalty to a spiritual kingdom did not make them an existential threat to the Roman state. To find common ground, Justin utilized respected Greco-Roman philosophical concepts. This diagram shows his core strategy, using the concept of the logos, or universal reason, as an intellectual bridge to explain Christian theology to a hostile Roman elite. While the legions maintained the walls of turf and stone on the frontier, Justin Martyr attempted to build a defensive wall of logic to protect a targeted minority within the Roman Empire. Far from the friction of the Eurasian empires, The year 156 CE saw a different kind of permanence being established in the jungles of Veracruz, Mexico. The Epi-Olmec culture operated entirely outside the reach or knowledge of the Mediterranean or Indian powers. This year marked the completion of the La Mojara Stela 1, a massive stone monument that serves as a testament to their societal complexity. The stela is carved with an intricate writing system and a long count calendar, demonstrating a deep focus on recording a permanent cultural legacy. While major Eurasian powers were tightening their grip on their own citizens to maintain ideological control, Mesoamerican civilizations were successfully recording their own independent history. By 160 CE, the political climate of the Mediterranean had hardened. The intellectual defense offered by Christian thinkers had failed to slow the state's demand for uniformity. Justin Martyr's publication of his Second Apology signaled that the standoff between the state and its non-conforming residents was entering a more dangerous phase. The Roman state reflected its power through its architecture. These imposing arches and columns visually reinforced a system that was now as immovable as the stone itself, making any ideological rebellion seem futile. The standoff in Rome mirrored the military reality at the borders. Whether through stone walls in the north or executions in the arena, the empires of the 150s were focused entirely on maintenance and control. This was a decade defined by the drawing of rigid lines. The map was no longer a work in progress. It was a finished document, divided into the acceptable and the forbidden. By 160, the major empires of the world had traded the momentum of the frontier for the paranoid security of the interior. They were no longer conquerors moving outward, but heavily fortified defenders watching their own shadows. The Roman Empire undergoes a massive transition of power. Antoninus Pius dies, leaving control of the ancient world to his two adopted sons, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Nature strikes the new co-emperors almost immediately. The Tiber River breaches its banks, sweeping through Rome, destroying granaries and triggering a severe famine right in the imperial capital. Before the mud can be cleared from the streets, a second threat emerges on the eastern frontier. The Parthian king, Vologases IV, seizes the moment of transition to march his forces into Armenia, destroying a Roman legion and threatening the province of Syria. Rome's immense territorial size required a highly calibrated administrative system to maintain order. When severe shocks hit the capital and the furthest frontier at the exact same time, the administration struggled to adapt. Marcus Aurelius stays in Rome to manage the food shortages, while Lucius Verus is deployed east. He takes command of a massive mobilization, pulling experienced legions from across the empire to repel the Parthian advance. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers push past the familiar Mediterranean coast, marching deep into the arid, unforgiving environment of Mesopotamia. The counteroffensive is brutal and effective. Between 161 and 164 CE, Roman generals drive the Parthians out of Armenia, push across the desert, and ultimately burn the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon to the ground. Pushing this far beyond their established borders exposed these concentrated troops to local environments and pathogens their immune systems had never encountered. In securing their eastern border, the Roman war machine effectively loaded a highly lethal biological payload into its ranks. The very troops responsible for the victory were about to carry an invisible threat back home. During the siege of Seleucia in the winter of 165 CE, a strange illness begins tearing through the victorious Roman camps. Based on medical texts, the pathogen tearing through Mesopotamia was likely smallpox. With zero built-in immunity, millions were susceptible. Returning legions marched westward through Syria and Anatolia, shedding the virus at every Mediterranean port. The empire's celebrated infrastructure, the paved roads and bustling maritime networks, worked exactly as designed. It moved men and material with incredible efficiency, inadvertently turning a localized outbreak into a massive transcontinental pandemic. That same year, 166 CE, on the far edge of the Eurasian trade network, a delegation arrives at the Han court in China. They carry rhinoceros horns and ivory, claiming to be envoys of the Roman Emperor Anton, likely Marcus Aurelius. Documented in Chinese imperial records, this visit marks the first direct diplomatic contact between the Roman and Han superpowers. The Silk Road had finally linked the opposing ends of the known world. But at that exact moment of global connection, the Han court is tearing itself apart. A faction of powerful palace eunuchs launches a vicious purge against their political rivals. Through decrees known as the partisan prohibitions, they strip thousands of scholar officials of their rank, imprisoning them and executing their leaders. The entire Chinese administrative state grinds to a halt. Back in Rome, the returning legions arrive in the capital. The disease sweeps through the densely packed streets, rapidly wiping out a massive percentage of the population and severely depleting the empire's tax base and military reserves. Seeing Roman garrisons decimated by sickness, Germanic tribes along the Danube, the Marcomanni, seize the advantage. They breach the northern frontier and pour into imperial territory. The exact decade that brought the far edges of the globe into direct contact also saw them buckle simultaneously. The extensive networks built for wealth and power transferred instability and disease just as easily. By the winter of 168 CE, the celebrated Greek physician Galen is stationed with the troops in Aquileia. He observes the outbreak firsthand, documenting the raging fever, throat inflammation, and the black pustules erupting across the skin. The contagion spared no class and no age group. At its absolute peak, historical accounts suggest the plague claimed up to 2,000 lives every single day within the city of Rome alone. The following year, the disease claims its highest-profile victim. Co-Emperor Lucius Verus dies, leaving Marcus Aurelius to manage a fractured, dying empire completely alone. With the army hollowed out, the treasury strained, and his governing partner dead, Aurelius abandons grand imperial ambitions. Rome transitions from expanding its borders to desperately trying to keep them from caving in.
To hold the line against the invading Germanic tribes, the aging emperor relocates to the freezing, mud-soaked military camps along the Danube. By 170 CE, he is isolated on the northern frontier. He spends his days burying friends, fighting a brutal war of attrition, and watching his people succumb to a relentless pandemic. In the evenings, he sits alone in his tent and begins to write. These private journal entries, later published as his Meditations, are frequently read as abstract Stoic philosophy. In context, they are a practical survival manual, the real-time psychological conditioning of a leader enduring continuous, cascading failure without losing his mind. The successive shocks of the 160s destroyed the 2-century illusion of the Pax Romana. Rome had spent generations building a sprawling, interconnected machine for dominance, only to discover that those exact same connections could deliver devastation straight to its core.
By the year 171, the Roman and Han empires were beginning to show signs of internal pressure. For centuries, the Pax Romana and the Han Dynasty provided order that seemed permanent, but that stability was starting to fray from the bottom up. These terracotta figurines represent the military power of the Han, yet by the early 170s, that power was struggling to maintain domestic peace. In the provinces, a stagnant government pushed peasants into the Shu Chang Rebellion, a desperate reaction to a state that could no longer protect them. In 172, a similar rejection of authority surfaced within the Roman Empire. A movement called Montanism began to spread, led by charismatic prophets who openly challenged the institutional hierarchy of the Church and the Roman state. People across both empires were exhausted by heavy taxes and a lack of clear leadership. As their local conditions worsened, they began turning to radical, extreme ideologies that offered a sense of certainty the state could no longer provide. These separate uprisings on opposite ends of the world were early signals that the imperial systems were losing their grip. The traditional ways of governing were no longer enough to keep the peace at the edges of the map. In 173, a massive volcanic eruption occurred here, at Lake Taupo in New Zealand. While the event was geographically distant from the empires of the West and East, Its impact on the atmosphere was immediate. The eruption triggered a sudden shift in the global climate, bringing cooler and drier conditions to much of Eurasia. Almost immediately, crop yields began to fail, causing food shortages from the North Sea to the Yellow River. This climate stress put immense pressure on the Roman frontier. Marcus Aurelius was already locked in a difficult campaign against Germanic tribes, and the failing harvests made it nearly impossible to sustain his legions in the field. These relief carvings depict a Roman army that was technically victorious but physically exhausted. By 174, the military was suffering from severe manpower shortages, having been thinned out by years of continuous combat and dwindling supplies. This sculpture honors Galen, the physician who recorded the arrival of the Antonine Plague. The disease tore through the weakened military camps in cities, finding easy targets in a population already struggling with the effects of the climate shock. The combination of a sudden climate shift, a widespread plague, and an overstretched military stripped the ancient world of its ability to recover from new threats. As the plague and famine continued, imperial authorities in both Rome and China grew desperate. Unable to stop the physical disasters, they began searching for groups to blame for the perceived loss of divine favor. New decrees in the province of Asia began specifically targeting Christians. They were stripped of their property and legal protections, as officials looked for a way to appease a populace terrified by the ongoing crises. This paranoia peaked with a violent pogrom in the City of Lions. Dozens of Christians were sent into the arena to be executed, a public display meant to demonstrate that the state was still in control of the spiritual order. The physical violence was paired with an intellectual one. In 178, the critic Celsus published The True Doctrine, an attack designed to paint Christianity as a dangerous and treasonous influence on Roman society. In Han China, the same cycle was playing out. As the state failed to provide relief for the plague, the peasant class turned to Taoist faith healers. These healers offered spiritual answers to physical problems that the corrupt imperial court chose to ignore. In both empires, political leaders failed to address the underlying causes of the crisis. They chose instead to punish marginalized groups and suppress dissent, further dividing their societies when they needed unity most. Marcus Aurelius was ruling an empire that had been hollowed out by a decade of disaster. For 80 years, Rome had relied on adoptive succession, a system where the sitting emperor chose the most capable man available to be his heir. This practice had created a string of 5 effective and respected leaders. Marcus Aurelius ended that tradition. He chose to elevate his biological son, Commodus, to the rank of co-emperor. Commodus was erratic and had no experience in governing. Placing an unqualified heir in charge of a traumatized empire was a gamble that would soon have consequences for millions. This choice meant that when the next wave of chaos arrived, Rome would be facing it without the merit-based leadership that had defined its most stable century. The decade of pressure reached its focal point in 180. Marcus Aurelius was at his military headquarters near the Danube, still trying to secure the empire's borders. Marcus Aurelius died in his military quarters on March 17th, leaving the empire in the hands of the son he had chosen to succeed him. With his father's death, Commodus assumed sole control over the Roman Empire. Commodus immediately ended the border wars, but his paranoid and erratic behavior at home ended the era of the 5 good emperors. The peace that had lasted since the start of the century was over. The fracturing of the Roman order was visible even in its provinces. On July 17, 180, the execution of the martyrs of Scilly in Carthage showed that the state was now more interested in enforcing religious conformity than in maintaining the law. At the same time, the Kushan Empire in Central Asia, represented by this Gandharan statue of the Buddha, saw the end of King Huvishka's stable reign. The Kushans had been the essential bridge between the West and East. As their stability faded, the trade and cultural links between Rome and the Han Dynasty began to break. In 180, the foundations of the 2nd century collapsed. With trade routes fraying and competent leadership replaced by erratic heirs, the ancient world entered a period of fragmentation and decline that would last for decades.
In 180 CE, Marcus Aurelius died in a military camp near the Danube. His death ended a period of relative internal peace that had lasted for over a century, leaving absolute control of the Roman Empire to his 19-year-old son, Commodus. Commodus quickly dismantled the administrative traditions of his predecessors. He replaced seasoned senators with personal favorites and began a series of paranoid purges, executing anyone he perceived as a threat to his authority. This shift toward tyranny was mirrored in the emperor's public image. He claimed divine status, appearing in statues as the reincarnation of Hercules, clutching a club and draped in the skin of a lion. The stability of the Roman state was shown to be reliant on the character of a single man. When that man prioritized personal cult building over governance, the empire's central institutions had no mechanism to restrain him. In Han China, a similar institutional rot was underway. Emperor Ling sat as a figurehead, while palace eunuchs used their proximity to the throne to monopolize the government, paralyzing the court with corruption and internal rivalries. This elite gridlock left the state unable to respond to a series of natural disasters. As the Yellow River flooded and diseases spread through the provinces, the peasantry faced both a collapsing agricultural cycle and an increasing tax burden to fund the lifestyle of the court. The pressure broke in 184 CE. A Taoist movement led by faith healers launched the Yellow Turban Rebellion, a massive uprising that spread across 8 provinces and threatened to overwhelm the imperial army. Unable to coordinate a defense from the capital, the Han court granted regional governors the legal authority to raise their own militias and collect their own taxes to fund them. This emergency measure allowed the governors to suppress the rebels, but it also created a new class of independent military leaders. The Han Dynasty had effectively surrendered its control over the empire's provincial armies. 5 years later, on May 13, 189, Emperor Ling died. The succession of his 13-year-old son, Liu Bian, reopened the power vacuum between the military commanders and the palace eunuchs. By September, General-in-Chief He Jin attempted to end the struggle. He plotted to bring regional troops to the capital to force the dismissal and execution of the eunuch faction. However, the eunuchs discovered the plot first. They lured He Jin into the palace under the pretense of a meeting with the Empress Dowager, where he was cornered and assassinated. The military response was immediate. When the eunuchs displayed He Jin's head to the troops outside, General Yuan Sha ordered his men to breach the palace gates. The resulting massacre destroyed the eunuch faction. Roughly 2,000 people were killed in a single night of violence as soldiers moved through the palace halls. The central government was effectively decapitated. With the eunuchs dead and the high command in disarray, the child emperor was left without a functional administration to protect him from the rising warlords. The warlord Dong Zhuo used the chaos to seize Luoyang. He deposed the teenage emperor and installed a younger puppet, Emperor Xian, ruling through him as a military regent. As the Han government collapsed into civil war, Rome was struck by a different crisis. In late 189, the Antonine Plague returned to the capital with a virulence the city had not seen in decades. Contemporary accounts describe up to 2,000 deaths daily in Rome alone. The medical knowledge of the era was powerless against the spread, and the state, under Commodus's erratic rule, was unable to organize any relief for the dying population. By the end of 189, the systems managing both superpowers were failing. The Han Dynasty was paralyzed by the political slaughter of its bureaucrats, while the Roman center was overwhelmed by a lethal pandemic. In March 190 CE, Dong Zhuo consolidated his power by poisoning the deposed teenage emperor, Liu Bian. This act of regicide ended any possibility of a peaceful return to the previous order. The regional warlords responded by activating the autonomous armies they had raised during the rebellions of 184. They formed a coalition to march on the capital and remove Dong Zhuo by force. Facing an army that vastly outnumbered his own, Dong Zhuo realized that Luoyang was no longer defensible. He decided to abandon the capital entirely and relocate the court further west. Before his retreat, Dong Zhuo ordered his troops to plunder the city and destroy it. They burned Luoyang to the ground, forcing millions of civilians into a mass exodus toward the new capital. The destruction of Luoyang left the Han Empire without a functioning center. As China fractured into autonomous military zones and Rome grappled with the ongoing strain of plague and tyranny, the centralized structures that had governed the ancient world for centuries gave way to localized rule.
On the final day of 192 CE, the established leadership of the Roman and Han empires shattered within hours of each other. The double assassination of a reigning emperor and a supreme warlord left the two ends of the Eurasian continent without central authority. In Rome, Emperor Commodus was strangled in his bath. The son of Marcus Aurelius had abandoned the careful administration of his predecessors, preferring to dress in a lion's skin and wield a club to emulate Hercules. His death abruptly terminated the long prosperity of the Nerva-Antonine Dynasty. Simultaneously in the Han Empire, the military turned its weapons inward. The brutal warlord Dong Zhuo, who had razed the capital and hijacked the imperial court, was assassinated by his own adopted son, Lu Bu. Centuries of established political tradition, systems built on orderly succession and the mandate of heaven, disintegrated almost overnight. In their place, a massive power vacuum opened. Rome immediately descended into chaos. Pertinax, the man named to succeed Commodus, attempted to discipline the Praetorian Guard. They murdered him after just 3 months on the throne. Roman political tradition then suffered a total degradation. The Praetorian Guards stood on the walls of their camp and literally auctioned the title of emperor to the highest bidder in the Senate, Didius Julianus. But the true power no longer rested in Rome. General Septimius Severus ignored the Senate entirely. He secured the loyalty of the legions stationed in Pannonia and marched his army directly on the capital. Julianus was executed just 9 weeks into his purchased reign. To pacify the western provinces while he secured the city, Severus tactically appointed the governor of Britain, Clodius Albinus, as his co-emperor. The events of 193 established a brutal new reality for the empire. Political legitimacy no longer required the approval of the Senate. It was dictated entirely by overwhelming military force. Severus was systematically eliminating his rivals, defeating Pessinnius Niger at the Battle of Issus. Meanwhile, Chinese warlords were fighting a similar war of attrition, searching for a way to legitimize their own territorial claims. This map shows northern China's fractured territories and the exposed Han emperor's Yan. Fleeing Chang'an after Dong Zhuo's assassination, the emperor wandered the countryside. Cao Cao executed a political masterstroke, intercepting the monarch and relocating the capital eastward to his stronghold of Suchong. By physically possessing the monarch, Cao Cao essentially seized the Han bureaucracy, converting imperial decrees into a mechanism to justify his own military campaigns. The emperor had been reduced to a tactical tool. He was the figurehead through which generals could legally execute their rivals and seize territory under the guise of loyalty. The danger of ignoring this strategy became obvious. The warlord Yuan Shu prematurely declared himself the first emperor of the new Zhong dynasty. This blatant overreach outraged his peers, instantly uniting competing factions against him. Septimius Severus made no such miscalculations. Having secured his eastern borders, he officially abandoned his pretense of shared rule and marched west, crushing his final Roman rival, Clodius Albinus, at the Battle of Lugdunum. Severus immediately pivoted east to punish the Parthian Empire for supporting his rivals. His legions advanced into Mesopotamia and violently sacked the capital of Ctesiphon. Imperial survival now required a strict formula: the systematic eradication of all domestic political rivals, financed directly by the plunder of foreign capitals. By the year 200, the fractured Chinese landscape forced a final decisive clash. At the Battle of Guandu, Cao Cao faced the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Northern Coalition led by Yuan Shao. Rather than fight a war of attrition, Cao Cao launched a surgical strike against Yuan Shao's main supply depot. The resulting destruction starved the larger army and created widespread panic in their ranks. The victory at Guandu eliminated the last credible threat to Cao Cao in the north. It also destroyed any remaining possibility of restoring the Han Empire, guaranteeing that China would remain divided into heavily armed competing states for decades. This militarization extended across the Eurasian continent. In Central Asia, the Kushan Empire under King Kanishka found itself locked in a constant struggle to defend its borders against regional uprisings and encroaching powers. In Rome, Septimius Severus stripped the Senate of its remaining authority. On his deathbed, his final instructions to his sons were explicitly clear: maintain good terms with each other, enrich the soldiers, and ignore everyone else. The internal peace and administrative governance of the previous century had been dismantled.
In its place stood a global system where political survival depended entirely on the patronage and support of the professional soldier.